All right. So today's lecture, on the 5th lecture of the course, is about convolutional neural networks. So we have seen for the past 4 weeks, we started with a recap on the fundamentals of machine learning. And then from this, I introduced neural networks in the second lectures, and then how to run backpropagation in these architectures. And this was the topic of the third lecture about automatic differentiation. And last week, we saw a few algorithms that you can use to train these neural networks, a few optimization algorithms that you can use to adjust the weights in a training loop. So with this 4 lecture, actually, you should know now almost everything you need to know in order to instantiate your neural network and then be able to train it in order to do what you want it to do. And so now, for the rest of this course, we'll focus on a few different architectures that are every time specialized to some specific kind of data. And so this is what we'll do today, starting with data that contains some special structures, like, for example, images, but that could also be the case for time series or one-dimensional signals of some kind, right? And so the main question that we'll try to answer today, can we make neural network to see? Okay, so Damien has a question, sorry about the project. Are the reports available somewhere? I'm not sure which report you are talking about. So the reports that I've shown you, they are the reports of past projects, and I will not make them public, if that's the one you are referring to. Right, so okay, we'll take this offline and continue with the course. Okay, so today will be about how to make neural network see, and the lecture will be divided into a few parts. So first I will try to tell you about what we know about visual perception in animals and in humans, and then how we can take inspiration from this to implement neural networks that would have that would leverage this knowledge in a sense in order to basically in order to be better adapted to this kind of data. And we'll see how to do that. We'll see the concept of convolutions and how to make use of that in neural networks. Then we'll see that we can combine these convolutional layers in some kind of hierarchy. And to do this, we'll need a new operation, which is called pooling. And then finally, given these two operations, we'll be ready to finally architecture neural networks that we call convolutional neural networks. So we'll go over a few popular architectures of convolutional neural networks, or ConvNets for short. And finally, I will try to show you what we can try to interpret about what is learned by this type of network. All right, so I will start with visual perception. And the story that I want to tell you about today is the one of David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel. So by the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, what they did was they were working on trying to understand the visual system in cats. And they basically discovered the neural basis of information processing in the individual systems of cats. And of course, that would generalize to other animals and to humans as well. And for this discovery, they were awarded the Nobel Prize of Medicine in 1981. And so basically what they've proposed, what they've first discovered and then proposed as a model is how basically cats, in this case, manage to see, right? And basically, what are the different steps that happen from the eye into the brain in order to make sense of an image? And so what they did as an experiment was to take a cat and then open its skull and then put electrodes at a few places. So first close to the eye, to the neurons. And when I say neurons now, I'm referring to biological neurons, of course. First close to the eye, and then further away into the brain. And what they discovered was some kind of patterns when they were, so basically the electrical signal that they recorded was changing depending on the kind of stimulus they were showing to the cat. And from these observations, they proposed a model that would explain how the visual system is actually organized. And this is what we'll see today. So I will start with this video that shows their experiment and how, and this is quite funny, how they actually started, how the hints that led them to their discovery.
The researchers actually listened in to individual nerve cells firing in the anesthetized cat as they presented it with different visual images.
When we started working, Torsten and I, in the late 50s, we set up our first experiments, and they didn't go well because at the beginning we couldn't make the cells fire at all. We'd shine lights all over the screen and nothing seemed to work. And rather by accident, one day we were shining small spots, either white spots or black spots, onto the screen, and we found that the black dot seemed to be working in a way that at first we couldn't understand until we found that it was the process of slipping the piece of glass into the projector, which swept a line, a very faint, precise, narrow line across the retina. And every time we did that, we'd get a response.
So what they explain is that...
And every time we narrow line across the retina.
So when they were slipping this piece of glass, right, while listening and recording the electric activity of the cells of this poor cat, is that,
and every time
you see, it's the cells were not responding when the cat was shown the black dot, but instead, and this was discovered by accident, it was responding when it saw this line entering its receptive field. And so if you hear closely, you will hear a crackling sound when the line passes through the screen.
And we did that, we'd get a response.
What? I will show you
Did that
again.
We'd get a response.
Oops.
Projector, which swept a line, a very faint, precise, narrow line across the retina. And every time we did that, we'd get a response.
And so from these observations, then they had some clue, and they made more experiments. This is what I will show you here.
In this experiment,
so what you will hear is, so now that they understood that these cells were actually responding to lines, so they only focus on this kind of patterns, and they will basically, so you still have this poor cat looking at the screen, and what is shown to the cat are lines of different directions and of different sizes. And what you will see is that depending on the cells that you listen to, for which you record the electrical activity, some of them respond depending on the orientation of the line, while some others do not.
Footage, a bright vertical line stimulates a small number of neurons in the visual cortex of a cat. The crackling sound is the electrical activity of these neurons as they respond to this retinal image. By listening to the intensity of this electrical activity, the researchers can determine the correct orientation of the line. But when the line is moved to a diagonal or horizontal position, the amount of stimulation decreases dramatically.
We're only at a very elementary stage when it comes to understanding something like how you recognize a face or something like that. The general region of the brain is known where things like that go on, but we don't have the slightest idea of what's happening at the level of single cells for that particular problem. But for more elementary problems, for the very first processes of vision, we do have a very good understanding of what happens at the very beginning. So it's just a start.
Misha Pavel of Stanford University.
All right, and in one of their famous papers to explain this, they have these two figures, so figure 19 and figure 20, and they basically propose a model which would explain at least these first steps of how the information is processed in the visual system. And so they first define what they call simple receptive fields and how it's organized. And they say that a large number of lateral geniculate cells, of which 4 are illustrated in the upper right of the figure, so at this place. And these are basically cells that would be really close or even in the background of the retina. Have receptive fields with on centers arranged along a straight line on the retina. And all of this would project upon a single cortical cell, so a cell which is a bit further away and, from the retina. And the synapses are supposed to be excitatory. So the receptive field of the cortical cell will then have an elongated on center, which is this one, indicated by the interrupted lines in the receptive field diagram to the left figure. So basically what they say is that you will have cells that will be specialized at recognizing patterns of, for example, lines, but also lines of a specific orientation. And so, for example, you would have these 4 cells that would basically listen or attend to the stimulus that would be at some position in the retina. And because you are connecting, for example, these 4 cells together to another cell, which they call a single cortical cell, what would basically happen is that this cortical cell would respond if all of the 4 others to which it is connected are also firing. Right? And so that means if there is light along this, or if there is this kind of pattern that you can see in the retina, so a line basically of this orientation, this means that all these 4 cells will trigger together, and if they trigger together, then this cortical cell will also trigger or fire. And so that means that cortical cell now will be able to detect these small lines at the specific location of the specific orientation in the retina. And of course, what they say is that there are other cells that, for example, would be specialized to detecting vertical lines. Others are specialized in the detection of horizontal or diagonal. And this was shown in the experiment. When you listen to the electrical activity of the cell, you see that some are only responding to a specific orientation of the lines, and as soon as you change this orientation, this same cell do not fire anymore. And then, in a second step of their model, what they say is that can combine the simple receptive field into complex receptive fields, which are made, which are basically built as a composition, as a hierarchical composition of simple receptive fields. And the idea, it's quite simple actually, is to say that, for example, you would have this first cortical cell, which has a simple receptive field that corresponds to this part of the retina, and which is looking for example, vertical lines. Right? So this dashed rectangle would correspond, for example, to the entire receptive field of the entire retina. And of course, then you would have cells that would only be attached to a particular location like this one, right? But this itself would, and these are not represented, but it would be connected to a bunch of other cells like the ones that are represented here in the previous figure. And then the idea of this more complex receptive field would be to combine this simple receptive field together. For example, there are 3 of them that are shown. And in some kind of hierarchical fashion, these 3 simple receptive fields would connect to another cell. And for example, these cells could have a behavior which is such that it fires, it triggers if one, not all, but for example, just one of the cells it is connected to triggers, right? And if that's the behavior, then that means that cell will basically trigger, will basically produce a stimulus if there is a line somewhere in the receptive field of the retina, regardless of its location, right? So basically what they say is that a number of cells with simple fields, of which 3 are shown schematically, so these 3 ones, are imagined, and this was just a model, to project to a single cortical cell of higher order, the one here below, each projecting neuron as a receptive field arranged as shown to the left, look like this one, this one, this one. And so that means an excitatory regions to the left and an inhibitory regions to the right of a vertical straight line boundary. And then the boundaries of the field are, and yeah, this is the most important sentence, any vertical edge stimulus falling across this rectangle, regardless of its position, will excite some simple cell field, so one of these 3, for example, leading to the excitation of the higher order cell. And by that, by this simple composition of 2 layers of cells, what they propose as a model was an explanation of how you can basically detect patterns like lines regardless of their location. Now, the question we'll be then interested in today is, can we, given this knowledge, these things that we understand about the visual systems in animals, can we get inspiration from this in order to basically improve the neural networks that we've been talking about so far? And in the jargon of deep learning, what we would say usually is that can we equip neural networks with inductive biases that would be tailored for vision? And by inductive biases, I mean basically additional assumptions that you make about the data that you are considering, so like images, and that you want to basically enforce, for example, directly into the architecture of the neural network. And so we'll see that this is quite useful. So even though I've already told you about the fact that simple multi-layer perceptrons are universal approximators, in practice, if you try to train an MLP to images, it would work. It could work to some extent, but it would not be usually not be very good, because there are many different configurations of the parameters that could equally minimize the training error, for example. But among all of those, many of them actually would not generalize very well. And so you can enforce what would happen in terms of generalization by this additional assumption, these inductive biases that we want to enforce in the neural network. And in this case, the inductive biases that we would like to enforce are the 3 following ones. So locality, and this is basically what happens with the simple cells. We would want to have basically part of the neural network that only look locally, for example, at the data, the signal at the image. At the same time, we would want invariance to translation. For example, if we are looking at images and the goal of our problem is to classify these images, then usually if there is an object, well, its location, if that object moves inside the image, the answer that we want to produce, or the output of the network, should not change, because usually this will not change the class of the image. If, for example, I know, if there is a cat in an image, regardless of its location, that image is still about a cat. And finally, the last ID, the last inductive bias, is hierarchical composition. So the fact that we want to detect patterns that we could define in some way as a composition of simpler patterns. So of course, this research on the visual system inspired quite a few researchers from the machine learning community. And so in the 1980s, Fukushima proposed the Neocognitron architecture, which is basically a direct neural network implementation of the hierarchy model of the visual nervous system of these two guys, Hubel and Wiesel. And so on the top, what you see is actually the model, the biological model, which is proposed by Hubel and Wiesel, and at the bottom would be the software equivalent, which was proposed by Fukushima. And it builds upon two important concepts that we'll talk about later on. The first one is the concept of convolution, which is basically a way to only look locally at some part of the images in order to detect features in these images, and also the hierarchical composition of these features that you would automatically detect with this convolution. And you can view that basically as a composition of simple cells that would be dedicated to the detection of local patterns, and complex cells that allows you to detect these things regardless of the location, and to do that repeatedly. So you would combine simple and complex cell, and then you would have a second layer of simple and complex cells again, and so on and so on. And this is exactly what Fukushima tried to do in his architecture, in the Neocognitron architecture. So unfortunately for him, it was almost working, but what didn't work was that together with this architecture, he also tried to have a training algorithm which also would get inspiration from biology. So he tried also to adjust the weights of the parameters of this neural network using a training algorithm which was based on the current understanding of how biological neurons are actually adjusted or adapt in nature. And this proves to be largely inefficient. Okay, so it didn't work at all. It's not because the architecture was bad, but in this case, it's because the training algorithm was really bad. And so a few years later, Yann Lequin, at the end of the 90s, managed to train convolutional neural network using gradient descent, where the gradients would be obtained using backpropagation. So this variant of automatic differentiation that we talked about 2 weeks ago. He also advocated at the same time for end-to-end feature learning in image classification. And so this is a result so from 20 years ago, where he managed, so this is Yann Lequin, where he shows a piece of paper here to a camera, and then these images are fed to a neural network, a convolutional neural network as the one I've just shown you in the previous slide. And the goal was to detect all the digits or all the letters, regardless of their locations, regardless of how they would be represented. So you see that you have different fonts. and still that same network is able to produce correct answers. So, okay, so this was for the motivation. Now let's talk about convolution, exactly what they are. This is something I've briefly mentioned. And I will take my time now to explain what are convolutions in neural networks and how we can make use of them. So the network that you know, that we've learned so far about is the multilayer perceptron. So, you could say that, okay, if this is my data, right, if this image is my input data, I could make use of this multilayer perceptron architecture. And at some point, or at the very first layer, what would happen if you were to do that? You would basically flatten this image into a very large vector, which has as many components as there are pixels in the image, and in which element is, for example, equal as a numerical value which corresponds to the intensity of each pixel. And then you feed this very large vector as input to a first fully connected layer, right, in which you do a matrix vector multiplication, and then you feed the result to an activation function like a ReLU, right? And then you would repeat that for a few layers until you get to the output of the network. So you could do that, but there would be two major problems if you try to do it on large images. The first one is that if this data was handled as normal and I would say unstructured unstructured vectors, then that means high dimensional signals, for example, high dimensional images, but that would also apply to sound, for example, would require models of a size which is typically too large. And the reason is that in this first layer, what you would have is a matrix which is the size of which is proportional to the number of pixels times the number of units that you want in the first layer, right? And so even for small images, that number of parameters would grow very quickly into millions or more, and that would be just for the first layer, right? And so if you want to have models that you can actually train, having maybe already at the start millions of parameters just for the very first layer is maybe not a good idea. Okay, but maybe you could say I have a very fast computer with tons of RAM, and that's not a problem. Fine. The more fundamental issue would be that if you now take the same image but just shift it by 2 or 3 pixels, like here, then that means to recognize this digit of 3, you would have to use other weights, because these intensity values would correspond to other elements in the vector. And that means the weights that are connecting these other elements should also be able to recognize that same digit. And so whatever you learn for the previous weight at the shifted location could not be reused for this shifted location. And that's something intuitively that you don't want, right? Because you know quite well that in this kind of data, in this kind of signal, you expect some invariance to translation, in a sense. And I will formally tell you what I mean with that later on. But what you intuitively would want to do is to be able to reuse, in a sense, the weights that you would have learned for this first location and to apply them again for this shifted location. Because you know that this is actually the same patterns that you are looking for, and its location should not be important, right? So a representation that what happens is that a representation meaningful at a certain location should be used everywhere, right? And this is an assumption, this is an inductive bias that you know should, would work and would work quite well in the case of images. And this is why you would like this to be enforced directly in the architecture of this neural network. But that will not happen if you just take a vanilla multi-layer perceptron with fully connected layers as the ones we have seen so far. So fortunately, there is a solution for that, and it's this idea of convolution. So a convolutional layer or convolution layer will basically implement this exact idea. It will apply the same linear transformation locally everywhere while preserving the signal structure. And so if we are dealing with a one-dimensional input, right, what would happen in the case of one-dimensional convolution is that you would define some kind of what we call kernel, which in this case would be made of 4 elements. And this kernel would basically correspond to weights in the regular neural networks. But what would happen is that you would compute the dot product of these weights with only some local region of the input, right? So for example, what you would do is that you would basically align this kernel at the first location with the 4 elements of the inputs. You would compute the dot product of this segment with the kernel, and that would produce the first output value. And then what you would do in a convolution is that you would slide this kernel at all valid locations in the input. So you would just, for example, slide the kernel by 1 unit, again, would compute the dot product locally on this region of the input, that would produce the second value, and you would repeat that so on and so forth until the end of the input vector. Let me just show you now something on the tablet, if that works. Of course, it does not. Let me restart it. Sorry, there is a small issue with sorry, I'm trying to connect my iPad to my Linux station and sometimes it fails. Don't know why it fails. It was working this morning. Oh. Ah, okay. Phew. That works. And so what I wanted to show you is basically this idea that, okay, in what we've seen so far in a fully connected layer is that you would start with some input data X, right? And then what would typically happen is that you compute a new representation of this data, which would be the output of the next layer, which we called, for example, H. And what we said is that, for example, this H vector is computed, in the case of a fully connected layer, as some linear activation of some matrix vector product plus some offset P, right? And so that means when you actually, when you compute, for example, this unit, what you are doing is that you are using all the weights. So you are using the entire input data, the entire input vector, to compute the value of this specific unit there. And so if you want to compute the output value of this other unit, you would have another set of different weights that would be dedicated only to this specific unit, right? But that's a regular fully connected layer. Now, in a convolutional layer, what will happen is that we'll start with the input data again as a vector. And the outputs now will be computed again as the products. But, for example, when you want to compute this particular, the output of this particular unit, what will happen is that, I don't know if this one is tied to, it will not, so there are two major differences. The first one is that, so let me just do this like this. The first one is that you will not use the entire input data in order to compute this specific unit. So you will only look at a subset of the input elements of this vector X. And so, for example, here, what I've shown is that I would be only using 3 elements in order to compute this unit. And then the second difference is that now, if I want to compute the output or the value of this other unit, what would happen is that I would also compute it from a subset of the input elements that would correspond to a different part or a different region in this vector. So that's this assumption of locality, right? You are only, we would be only using a local part of the input in order to compute the output. And then this notion of invariance would be the fact that these weights here, right, they're actually the same as these ones, right? And so we would, and they would not be duplicated, right? They would be really just 3 values, 3 numerical values that I would just keep reusing at different places, right? So these weights here would be shared. This is what we say in deep learning. We say that these parameters would be shared, right? So that's exactly the same variable that would be reused. So that means that when we'll optimize this neural network, when we modify the parameters values, of course, that will affect the computation of all these units at once, right? And this is different from the previous case, because here the weights, right, they were not shared. They were really specific to that unit and to this other unit. Now these weights, these 3 weights, this is why I've shown them in blue, green, and red, are really the same. They are really the same objects, and they will, when you modify the value, for example, the blue weights, that will affect all the outputs, all the values in the H vector, and not just one specific unit. Okay, so it's already 10. So I propose that we make a short break of 10 minutes, and would resume at 10:15. Meanwhile, if you have questions, please ask them in the chat, and I will answer them after the coffee break. Right, so welcome back. We'll resume. So we just stopped after introducing the concept of convolutions in the case of one-dimensional input vectors and one-dimensional vector kernels. And so, as you see in this animation, the idea is intuitively quite simple. You just take a kernel, which is basically a small tensor, a small vector, in this case, and then you slide it through at every possible location in some input vector. And then for all of those locations, you compute the dot product between the kernel and the part which is aligned with the kernel in the input. That produces some value, and then you repeat that for all of those locations. That's the result of the convolution. So we can describe that mathematically, of course. So in the case of one-dimensional convolution, what we would have is that we start with some input vector x, which is made of w real values. And then we would have also a convolutional kernel u, which is made of a smaller number, small w, of other real values. And then we would define the discrete convolution x star u as a vector, in this case of size big W minus small w plus 1, such that the element I in this vector is defined simply as the dot product between the segment of some location or some subset of element in X and the kernel vector, right? And so that basically boils down to a sum from m equal to 0 to w minus 1. So you just iterate over all the values in U, the kernel, and then for all of this value, you compute the element-wise product between x at location, between the value at location m plus I in x and the value in the kernel at location m, right? So in the machine learning community, we usually call this convolution, even though for those of you who may have followed other classes, in particular signal processing, this operator actually corresponds to the cross-correlation operator. And this is something actually you can read about. So I'm not sure exactly why originally it was called a convolution, but we stick to this name nevertheless. But if you read now, for example, the documentation of libraries like PyTorch, they will have also this fine print where it says that this is actually the cross-correlation operator. Anyway, what is nice is that even though this looks like a very simple idea, you can already use it for various purposes. One of them is that you can use this convolution in 1D, for example, to implement differential operators. So if this first vector is your input x and minus 1, 1 is your kernel, then if you apply the convolution of this kernel onto this input vector, the result would be, for example, given by this output vector. And what happens is that it would basically amount to the detection of edges, to the detection of changes in value in the input vector. And you see that indeed, for the part which is constant at 0, the output is 0 as well. For the other parts made of 4s, it's also constant. But for the locations in X, in the X vectors, at which you see a change in between two neighboring values, so when you go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4, then there is a signal, and this is the convolution operator detects these changes, right? So intuitively, you can then, I suppose, understand that of course, this will extend to more than one dimension, and in the same way, we'll be able to use convolution in order to detect edges in images. Similarly, you can also use convolution in order to implement crude template matchers in which you would look for patterns that are similar to the kernel. So for example, if the kernel now is made of 3 elements, 1, 0, and 1, then if you apply this to this input data, you would see that the output would be maximum, for example, at this location, and you see this peak, and everywhere where it's flat, it will be minimum, and when there is only when the kernel is only partly matching with the input, you see that it produces some intermediate value. Right? When, for example, when only one of the 2 peaks are present, it produces a peak like this. But when the 2 of them together are present, that means the template is matched better in this case, and then you see that you obtain as output an even higher value than in the other case. And so, as I just said, convolutions generalize to multidimensional tensors of arbitrary dimensions, 3, 4, 10, 1000 if you wanted. But when it comes to dealing with natural signal, I would say, in its usual form, we would just define it on a 3D tensor. For example, images that are so images that correspond to 3D tensors of size h times w, so for the height and the width of the image, times c, which would correspond for a certain number of channels that you would have in the image. So in the case of RGB images, you would have 3, because you have 3 channels, one for red, another one for green, and the last one for blue, times the height and the width of the image. And in the jargon of deep learning, we would call this tensor the input feature map. Then similarly, then we would have now a kernel, which is now upgraded to a 3D tensor, whose dimension is c times h times w, where small h and small w, of course, are smaller than the size of the images. That would slide across the input feature map along its height and the width. And we would call also the h times w the size of the receptive field of that kernel. And then similarly as before, at each location of this, at each valid location of the kernel, when we slide it across the input tensor, we would compute the element-wise product between the kernel and the input element. It overlaps, and that result, all these products would be summed together, and that would be the result of the convolution at this location. And so this is what would happen. So, for example, if we have an image like this of size h times w with 3 channels, we would define, for example, a kernel like this, which would be a smaller tensor, and then we would slide this green kernel at all possible locations across the input feature map, and then for each possible location, we would report the result of the convolution in the output tensor. And of course, we could repeat that for different kernels. So this is shown for a first one in green, but we could have a second one in red, and that means we would have a second slice of output as shown here in the animation. Right? So formally, the final output that I will denote by O will be a 2D tensor. So we would start from a 3D tensor, but the result of the convolution would be a 2D tensor, which size is given by this expression, so it's smaller than the size of the diagonal image. And we call this output the output feature map. And this is computed exactly as just described. You would say that the element ji of this output feature map is computed as some offset p, that would be parameters of the convolutional layer, plus the result of convolutions that you would apply at each, that would be defined for every channel C in the input feature map. Right? And so here we would just slide across, so we would take the kernel and then we would say that we compute the result of the convolution for each slice of the kernel across the channels. Then we would just sum the results all together. And at the end of the day, that means we would just be computing these triple sums of all these elements. And then if you repeat this operation for not only one, but several different kernels, let's say D, then you would obtain D slices of this dimension, right? So the output feature map would be of dimension which correspond to this expression. And we would say that the depth of the feature map is equal to T. And so you could have said that maybe we could swipe across also the kernel across the third dimension, but usually it does not make any sense to do that unless that third dimension that you're considering has some metric meaning. But that will depend on the application. Right? You could have said that this corresponds to a cube or some hypercube, and then you have a kernel which width or which number of channels is not equal to the number of channels in the input, and so you consider all possible locations also by sliding across the channel dimension. But this only makes sense if there is some metric meaning between these channels, if there is some special structure across the channels. If the channels are more or less independent from one to another, then it does not make sense to do that. All right, now we can move on. Now we've defined convolutions. Typically, convolutions have some refinements, and so 3 additional parameters are defined as follows. So the first is padding, and it will specify the size of a frame that you would put around the input. Then you could also specify a stride, which specifies a step size when moving the kernel across the signal. So not only you could decide to move the kernel at every possible location, so that means with a step size of 1, but you could say that actually you don't do that and you slide it across with a step of 2 or 3 or larger. And then finally, a dilation parameter, which will modulate the expansion of the filter without adding parameters, without adding weight. All right, so in the case of padding, this is the picture that you should have in mind. So padding is as if you were adding a border, some artificial border or virtual border around the input. And this border would be containing always the same value, typically like zeros, or you could mirror maybe the neighboring pixels if you wanted. And the result of this is that when you artificially increase the size of the input, you will also increase actually the size of the output. And this is actually quite useful if you want to preserve the spatial dimension of the feature map across the layers, the convolutional layers that you will define. Because if you paid attention, for example, here, when you apply the convolution, the size of the output is actually reduced with respect to the size of the input. And maybe you would want to preserve the size of the input in the output. Right? And this is something you can do if you say that actually my input is virtually larger than what it is. I will just I will pad this elements with zeros, and the result will be then an output which dimension can be matched with the dimension of the output. All right. Then the second parameter that I mentioned is the slide. And so it's basically correspond to the step size that you use to slide the kernel across the signal. And actually, this is useful if you want to reduce now the spatial dimension of the feature map, the output feature map, by a constant factor. So if you take a step size of 2, then typically the size, the dimension of the output feature map will be smaller almost by a factor of 2. While preserving the spatial structure, of course, of the signal. And finally, you have the dilation parameter, which, as I said, modulates the expansion of the kernel support. So it's as if the kernel, so the green, the U tensor was larger than what it actually is. And the way you would do that is that you would add rows and columns that are made of zeros in between the coefficients. And the result of that would be that without increasing the number of parameters, the number of values that you need to represent the kernels, you would actually increase the receptive field, the size of the receptive field of the kernel. So the kernel now, so that means the local regions that the kernel is considering would be larger. Alright, so this is nice because all of these properties together and the convolution itself make it possible to have layers that are equivariant, and that would be equivalent specifically to translation. So what does that mean to be invariant? If you take some mathematical function f, you will say that it is equivariant to some operation, to some operator g, if the value of f of g of x is the same as the value of g of f of x. So if g, in this case, is an operation that would just shift its input by, so it would translate the inputs if this is an image, then what will happen is that f would be equivariant to this translation if first computing f to the original data and then translating this output was the same as first translating the input and then computing the result through this f function. Right. And this is what actually will happen in a convolutional layer because of the weight sharing. We will basically obtain a function which is equivariant to translation. And this is what you see in the animation. This is the input image, and this, the first column on the left, they represent the output of 6 different kernels in a convolutional neural network. And this would be a first layer of convolution. And what you see here is that if you shift the input image, you see that the result in the output of the convolutional layer is also shifted by the same amount. Right? So if an object moves in the input image, then that means its representation will move by the same amount in the output. And so this is quite useful actually because equivariance, so equivariance is useful when we know that some local function is useful everywhere. Like for example, detecting edges in an image. And this was one of the properties, one of the inductive biases that we wanted to enforce, and that now we know that we've obtained. However, and this is quite important, convolution is not equivalent to any type of transformation, in this case, it's only equivariant to translation. If, for example, you rotate or rescale the image, then unfortunately, the output of the convolutional layer will not be rotated or rescaled by the same amount. There are improvements to convolutional neural networks that make this possible for actually a whole class of transformation, but this is out of the scope of this course. But by default, the kind of convolutional neural networks that you will be using, you should be aware that, for example, in your project, if you want to detect some object and you want some level of robustness, you should know that if that same object moves around the image, that will be fine. But if that object rotates or increase in size or decrease, then the convolutional neural network may not work anymore. Unless, of course, this was also observed in the training data. All right. Then the last technical things I want to tell you about today about convolution is the fact that convolution can actually just a special case of the fully connected layers, and this is something we can derive mathematically, and this is what we'll do now. So let's just switch again to the iPad. If that works. Of course, it does not. Yeah, it works. So first, what we have just seen is that we've defined a new operation, the convolution operation between some input and some kernel u. And the way we define this was to say that you start with some input x, input vector x, or input tensor, and then you also define a kernel u, and then you slide it across all locations in the input vector, and then that results in a new in a vector or in a new tensor that we call the output feature map H, right? What I want to show you is that this operation can actually be expressed exactly as the operation that we would have in a fully connected layer. And so basically, the question will be, can we express this as something which looks like this for some value of b and some value of w? And the answer is yes. And you can actually see that if you say that, okay, this will be your H vector, right? And this is equal. Okay, so if we want this to be equal to our convolution, we would have a matrix like this, which would be our WT, which multiplies some input vector x plus b. Now, this operation, this matrix vector multiplication, is equivalent to our convolutional operator when there is some particular structure in the matrix W, right? And so what will basically happen is that if, okay, let's take this, we'll divide the matrix like this, right? And similarly for the columns. And okay, so to compute this first element in the output feature map, what we would do is that we would compute the dot product between this row and the entire input x, right? But in a convolution, this is not what we do at every location. What we do is that we just focus on some part of the input vector, right? Because of this locality inductive bias. And that's just the equivalent of saying that a large part of this vector is just made of zero, right? And so what could happen is that maybe we would have some value here, maybe another value here, and then a third value at the next column. But then everything else here for this first row would be equal to 0. Right? And the result of that would be that now this first output would be computed only, what would happen is that we would have a sum for I equal to 0 to 2, right? Of the blue, or maybe I should just say what we would have is the blue weights times x0 plus the green weights times x1 plus the red weights times x2, right? And then for the next location, the next element in the output feature map, this one, what would happen in a convolution is that we would reuse the same kernel, except that it would be applied to another set of inputs, and the one that is just next to the previous one. And so it's as if we're actually reusing the same values, but shifted by 1 unit. Right? And what would then happen is that in terms of the input, so this would correspond to this one, right? And then the second one here would be computed as x1 plus x2 plus x3, with the blue weights, the green weights, and the red weights, right? And now x0 would no longer be used because it corresponds to a 0 coefficient in this matrix, right? And so what you see here is that actually the structure now is quite simple. It's as if we had a diagonal matrix or a band matrix where we have something like this, right? Green. Okay, so technically this is what we call a circulant matrix because the rows are equal to one another except that they are shifted by 1 unit. Right? And what would happen at the end also, you can make the values to wrap around. So at some point, for example here, at the very last row, okay, you could say that so either this, so there are two choices. In what we've seen, we've defined that the very last row, right, correspond to red, green, and blue, right? But you could go further if you wanted and say that you have 2 more rows, for example, like these ones, and then you wrap around the values of the kernels. So you would have here the red that starts again, and green and red. And the result of, so in what I've shown before, it's the first situation, but you could generalize that to this, and it's as if you were in a sense mirroring the values instead of padding them with 0. And when you do that, of course, then the dimension of the output feature map will be the same as the one of the input feature map, right? And so this is nice because now this shows you that indeed a convolutional layer is nothing else than a particular case of a fully connected layer, and can be expressed using exactly the same expressions. It's a vector which is equal to a matrix vector product plus some vector, and this generalized to of course more than one dimension. You can define this in the same way for images or tensors of larger dimensions. All right, so this is what I also show in the slide in the case of 2D inputs, where I consider a vector of size, an input vector of size 4 by 4, convolved with a tensor, a kernel of size 3 by 3. The result would be a tensor of size 2 by 2, with these values. And this is what would happen is that you would put this kernel at all 4 possible valid locations in the input, and for each of them you would compute the element-wise products, you would sum them all together, and that would produce this value. And what I'm saying there is that, okay, you can re-express that in terms of a circulant matrix, as I've shown you in the previous example, and this generalized to this case as well. What you would obtain is technically known as a sparse two-pleat circulant matrix, which has as many rows as you have values in the output feature map. So in this case, we would have 4 rows because we have 4 values. And you have as many columns as you have elements in the input feature map. And then you would set the values in this way. So what you see there is a circulant matrix again, because all these rows are all the same, except that they are shifted by 1 unit every time. And they are not, so you see that it's not just a band matrix as before, but there is more structure, because when you have, for example, this 3 by 3 kernel, okay, you would have this first row which multiplies this one, but also the second row now which multiplies these 3 first elements in the second row of the X input, right? And this is what you see there, and the same for the third row, and so on and so forth. But if you define it in this way, then if you compute the matrix vector product of this matrix with the flattened input X vector, you will obtain exactly the same values, right? And this even generalized to more dimensions, and this is what is explained in this slide. I don't think it's too important to go over that very precisely, but the main message from this is that indeed a convolution is nothing else than a special case of a fully connected layer. Right? Now, what is also important is that even though it's a special case, it does not mean that it's actually implemented in this way in a deep learning library, right? Because if you were just to say that all the convolutional layers are implemented in the same way as a fully connected layer, you would not profit, you would not leverage the fact that these matrices are very sparse, right? And so if you were not leveraging the fact that it's mainly full of zeros, then you would waste a lot of computation. So of course it's not implemented this way, but I think it's important to understand that this is a special case of a fully connected layer, right? And why I'm saying this, it's because this is precisely what we wanted to do. So we wanted to have an inductive bias, which would basically restrict the set of solutions of our neural network. And this is what we are saying. I'm just saying that now, instead of possibly identifying any matrix W, right, we will be only restricting to those that correspond to this convolutional operator. Okay, so what time is it? Okay, I will move on with pooling, which will be quick. So pooling is another operation which is complementary to convolution. And it can be used when the input volume is quite large in order to reduce the dimension in order to reduce its dimension while preserving the global structure of that signal of this data. So intuitively, it's just nothing else that as if you were downscaling an image in a computer program where you can, for example, reduce the size of pictures, right? When you reduce the size, indeed, you have reduced the number of pixels, you've reduced the number of elements in its representation, but the global structure is still preserved. Unless, of course, you reduce it too much, in which case then you will start losing the small details, and if you reduce it really by a lot, then you can, of course, discard a lot more information. Mathematically, pooling is defined very similarly as convolution. And so here in this slide, I define two different ways to implement pooling. The first one is called max pooling. And so if your input is again a 3D tensor of size C, the number of channels, times R times H times for the 8, and times S times W for the width. Then if you say that if you pool an area of size small h times small w, then you will the result of the pooling will be a new tensor, a new output tensor O, which size is C times R times S. Right? And such that basically you've just considered all disjoint locations of this pooling area across the input tensor, and then you apply some mathematical operation to basically aggregate all the values in this area. And so when you do max pooling, what you do is you aggregate by taking the maximum value, and when you do average pooling, you aggregate by computing the mean value. Right? So as an animation, this is what you would do. You would consider, for example, these gray areas, which would have which would correspond to the pooling areas, and then at each of these locations, you would compute some value, for example, the max value within the values contained in there, or the average value. And in this way, you would obtain now a new output tensor, which size is smaller by a factor W times H, but which preserve, we hope, the global structure of the signal. Now this is quite nice because this new operation makes it possible to have functions which are now invariant to some operation. And in particular, in the case of pooling, this pooling operation will provide invariance to any permutation inside the pooling area. And that indirectly will result in pseudo-invariance to local translation. So by that we mean, if you just shift now the data by just a tiny amount, as long as everything stays within the same pooling areas, the result of the pooling will not change. Right? And so technically, we would say that some function f is invariant to some other function g if the result of the function applied to the raw data is the same as the result of the function applied to the transform data gx. Right? So G could be permutations or some local permutations of the pixels, for example, or some shift of the pixels, and you would obtain then pseudo invariants to, for example, translation or local translation. And so this is very helpful because if we are dealing with a problem where we think it's more important to detect the presence of a pattern regardless of its exact position, this is exactly what we will achieve with this pooling operator. Right. And remember, this is actually what these complex cells introduced by Hubel and Wiesel are actually doing. They would be aggregating the stimulus of these simpler cells, which are dedicated to specific locations, but they would aggregate them all in some kind of pooling way, such that this complex receptive field then triggers, it fires upon the presence of some pattern, like one of these vertical line, regardless of its location in the receptive field. All right. So with this, we can move on to architectures of neural networks that we call convolutional neural networks. And so a convolutional neural network now will be, for us, generically defined as a composition of convolutional layers, as the one we've seen, that I will denote by this conv keyword, pooling layers, linear rectifiers like ReLUs. It could be, of course, other activation functions like sigmoid or hyperbolic tangents or other more recent activation functions, and also fully connected layers. And so what is shown here is a diagram of one such convolutional neural network, which is made, which is built again as a composition of this simpler layer. And in this case, this convolutional neural network would take as input this image. Then the first layer would be a convolutional layer, which in this case, for example, would be made of two kernels. And so it would transform the image first through the first kernel to obtain this output feature map. And then maybe we would have another kernel which would transform the input feature map into this other output feature map. And you see here that what is represented is that they would capture edges, but in different along different orientations. And then usually what is done is that we pass the output of a convolutional layer into a nonlinear activations like a ReLU. And this would then, for example, in this figure, would produce this new representation of the data. And then typically what is done is that then we feed this through a pooling layer in order to reduce the dimension of the input feature map. And then we repeat this pattern a few times. So now this two images, right? It's as if we had a new image, but now which width and height is smaller by a factor of 2, and the number of channels in this case has changed from, for example, RGB to these two new channels that are the result of these two convolutional operators, right? But again, this is nothing else than some kind of structured data. And we could apply then the same, we could use that as input to another convolutional layer, which would then have another output, which would be fed to another nonlinear activation, and so on and so on. And the purpose of stacking several convolution layer, ReLU, and then pooling, so this block a few times, if you stack them a few times like this, what will happen is that even though the receptive field of the kernels in the convolutional layer may be of the same size, so for example, in order to compute this output feature map, we could use a kernel of some small size, and that means it would only look, for example, at this at small regions like the one shown in red, right? In order to compute its value. And that would produce this output, as we have seen. Now, if we apply a second layer of convolution, but now to the pooled version of the data, right? Even though we would be using kernels that would be of the same size, like, for example, this small square, right? Since we would apply them to the reduced version of the image, it's as if, in a sense, we would apply these kernels. It's as if we would be using larger kernels on top onto the original image. And so in effect, what will happen is that by composing these layers in some kind of hierarchical fashion, we would have convolutions that start looking for patterns that are more and more global in the image, right? And this would themselves be defined as a composition of the simpler patterns that are detected in the previous layer. Right. So, but we'll talk about that in the final part of today's lecture. What time? Let me see. Yeah, okay, I will go until there, and then we'll have the break. And so, if you want a generic recipe to design a ConvNet, the architecture usually is defined in this way, and so there is no standard recipe. This is something we would have to experiment and see what works best, of course, on your problem. But usually it's really defined in this way. So you would have a bunch of convolution ReLU layers, right, that you repeat a certain number n of times, and that, like 1, 2, or 3 times, or maybe more. And then you would pool the result of these n layers in order to reduce the dimension. And then you would repeat this pattern, this whole pattern, a certain number m of times, in order to then look at patterns that are more and more global with respect to the original image. And then finally, you would flatten this the resulting feature map into a flat vector that you would feed as input to a regular fully connected neural network, like an MLP, which would be made itself as a certain number k of fully connected and ReLU functions. Right? And so, for example, when this n, m, and k are equal to 0, what you recover is a simple linear classifier. If n and m are equal to 0, then you recover just the regular k-layer MLP, and then with other values you recover this actually convolutional neural networks, which would be this one would be simple, but maybe too simple, but that you could make more complicated by setting other values to these repetitions of layers. And so, as an example, this is showing the feature map of a convolutional layer, of a ConvNet, which is architecture exactly in this way. So it's working by taking this image as input, and then the first column represents the output of a convolutional layer, and then this convolutional layer is passed as input to a ReLU, for example, which again is fed as input to a second convolutional layer, fed in the fourth column to ReLU, and then in the fifth, which is finally pooled to reduce the dimension. And then this whole pattern is repeated 3 times. So you would have a second set of 5 columns, which do the same: convolution, ReLU, convolution, pooling, and finally a third time: convolution, ReLU, convolution, ReLU, and pooling. And finally, you are left with this with this new representation of the data. You flatten it into a vector, and you pass that to an MLP, to compute, for example, probability estimates for the class associated to this image. Okay, so after the break, I will show you a demo which shows you this architecture in PyTorch. Meanwhile, there is a question by Stefan. How can one understand the contribution of each layer? This is also something I will talk about in the last part of today's lecture. And we see that there are several ways to try to visualize what is learned and what triggers specific kernels in this architecture. All right, so it's 11:05. Again, let's resume in 10 minutes at 11:15 for the last part of today's lecture. All right, so welcome back. So before we move on with the slides, I just wanted to show you how it works in practice and why it's actually important to make these assumptions or to convince you that making these additional assumptions about some structure in the data can lead to better generalization. So this is what is shown in this notebook. So I will just maybe increase the font like this. And so this is just standard PyTorch code as the one you will or you already have written in the homework. And what we'll do is that we'll try to or we'll compare the performance of regular multilayer perceptrons against a convolutional neural network when the task is to classify these images of digits, right? And so what I will do, so this is some code in which you see that I'm first defining two-layer MLP, two hidden layers, and then one output. And for the convnet, what I'm doing is that I would be chaining convolution ReLU pooling, and then again convolution ReLU pooling, and finally I would be flattening everything into a vector and feed that as input to a small MLP, in which the first operation is just a dense layer with ReLU activation, dense layer, and then finally the output. Right. Then I need some code to run to train this neural network and then to evaluate it. Fine. This is what we've seen so far. And so first, what I will do is to train the MLP. So my training data has a size of 60,000 images. And what we observe is that at the end, on some test set made of 10,000 other images, I reach an accuracy with this MLP, which is about 87%. And note that here I've shown also the number of parameters that define this neural network. It's about 6,000. And now I will do the same, except that I will architecture the neural network to be a convolutional neural network, but which will be made exactly of the same number of parameters, so 6,442. And I will train it on the same data. You see the number of parameters is identical. And then I train this thing, again, just using stochastic latent descent with momentum in this case. And now you see that the accuracy on the test data is significantly better. So it goes from 87% up to 95%. Right? And this is because we are actually exploiting some structure in the data. We know that it's certainly beneficial to look only locally at parts of the image, and then to compose these patterns that we detect locally into higher and higher activations of, or I would say, higher order activations, and then to feed that as input to the to a regular MLP. Right? And again, this is because we have enforced the right prior knowledge, the right inductive biases, right? So locality and stationarity, and then also pooling in order to obtain some translation invariance. Now, of course, you could say maybe this is just a maybe I cherry picked this example, and on another problem this would be different. So to convince you that this is really the case, what you could do is to train on the same images, but in which you've shuffled all the pixels, right? And so now the data would look like this, right? So I've not actually destroyed the information, I've just shuffled the locations of the pixel. And each image, of course, are shuffled exactly in the same way. So there is a question by Louis. Can you explain the number of parameters of the convolutional net, I suppose, that correspond to the last fully convolutional map? Which one? Not sure to understand the question, Louis. So these two networks have the same number of parameters in total, and so of course the part, the smaller, in this case, here from here, the smaller MLP, which is also part of the convnet, has a number of parameters which is smaller than the other MLP here. Let's see 2 layers. So out channels, how many? 10, I suppose. So in the last, so your question is about the last layer. So the last layer is basically taking as input some vector of some size, and then resizing or projecting this vector into a vector which dimension is the same as the dimension of the output. So in this case, we would have 10 classes. So that means the output would be a vector of 10 values. And therefore, the matrix which is involved here in this FC2 operation has a size which is about the size of the previous layer times 10. And I'm not sure exactly how many parameters we have exactly. It depends on the size of these other operations, of these other tensors. What is the relative size? Okay. Yeah, that I wouldn't know. Well, maybe. Let's see. So if we know CNN. Yeah. And model, what did I call that? FNN. Right. So you see that for the the first MLP, we go from about 700 elements to 8 values, 8 units, and then we have a layer of 8 units that produce a second layer of 8 units, and these 8 units are finally mapped to 10 units. Now with the convnet, what we do is that after convolving the image twice and pooling them, we would have an input feature, an input vector of size 96, and we map that. We map then this vector into to the first layer of the MLP, which is composing this CNN, into 50 values, which are then again projected on the 10 values corresponding to the output. Right? Does that answer your question? I suppose. So let's move on. So I was about to show you, what if we just shuffle the pixels, right? In the same way, of course, across all the images. So when we do that, what happens is that these digits are still there, because if we knew the permutation, we could recover them. But of course, if we show that to a neural network, it will not know about this permutation. So what we are doing here explicitly is to destroy this spatial structure which was special in this data, right? Because we knew it was images, and we knew that we could make use of locality, invariance, and these other concepts. But of course, now in this new representation of the data, these things do not hold anymore, because pixels that were close to one another in the original representation, when they are shuffled, they are not close to one another anymore, right? So if we train now our ConvNet on our permuted pixels, let's see what would happen. So we see that the accuracy on the test set has dropped significantly. So we were reaching 95% accuracy, and now we are down to 81%. And this is because now our assumptions that are no longer valid for this new data. However, if we train the fully connected network on these permuted pixels, let's see what would happen. So now the accuracy is 88%. Before it was 87. So we are just observing some variation due to the randomness in the training procedure, but it's about the same. And the reason is that for an MLP, there is no spatial structure. It's not exploiting any of that. It's just considering that the image is a flat vector of elements, and their location and the location of the values in this vector are not important, right? So this is why we are not observing any significant difference in terms of accuracy for the MLP, right? Right, so this was just to show you that making the appropriate assumptions can be beneficial if they are really met on the data that you're dealing with, and on images, natural images. Of course, the assumption of a ConvNet will be very useful. However, if you make assumptions that they are not met on the data, you will not gain anything, and actually this may deteriorate your performance with respect to the situations where you would not have made these assumptions, right? Because this is exactly what you observe. Here the ConvNet is even performing better than the MLP on this image. So question from Stéphane, could we transform the input images, for example, with Fourier to reduce the size of the picture and then train the network on the Fourier parameters? Yes, you could do that if you wanted. Yeah. There are actually connections between convolutions and this kind of transformation. I can give you some pointers on Discord if you're interested about it. All right, so now let's go back to the lecture. This is done. Okay, now for the rest of this lecture, I just want to browse through a few architectures of ConvNet that have been proposed over the years. So we have already seen a few of them, but there are some particular that are more popular than others. The first one that I would like to mention is LeNet5, which is a variant of this neural network that we have seen in one of the earliest video. But this is nothing else than one instance of this pattern that I was telling you about. So this network is made for images of 28 by 28, in order to identify digits or letters. And then you have a first layer of convolutions with 6 different kernels. Then it's followed by a pooling layer to reduce the feature map by a factor of 4 in this case. Then again, this is fed as input to another convolutional layers. In this case, you would have 16 different kernels, and then pooling, and then finally, all of these values are flattened into a vector of 120 elements, and you have an hidden layer here, a fully connected layer, and finally the output, which is a vector of size 10, because this is for digits only, actually. Of course, this is a very simple network, but already you can use it to classify the small images. So for very long, this is from 1998. The same network can actually be seen in previous papers by Yann Lequin. And what happened is that for many years, people really did not manage to train networks which were very deep in terms of the number of layers. They were always restricted to architectures of maybe 3, 4, 5, but really not more than that. And this was due to the reason that we've talked before, this vanishing gradient problem. And so it's only till later on, for example, in 2012, that people started to build networks and to manage to train them actually, even though they were containing more and more layers. And so AlexNet is an 8-layer convolutional neural network followed by a 3-layer MLP. So it's again the same pattern: convolution pooling, and then a bunch of convolutions. You see that the strides here is not equal to 1, and by doing that, you are it's as if you were pooling in a sense, because the output, the dimension of the output will also be reduced proportionally to the stride. Okay, and this AlexNet network is quite popular. That paper is cited tens of thousands of times, and the reason it's because it's the first neural network to have won the ImageNet competition by a significant margin, like 10 or 15% at once, I don't remember. And this really set a new direction in computer vision, which then was based on almost entirely on convolutional neural networks. And from this point onward, people just started from this architecture and try to increase actually the number of layers. So two years later, in 2014, came the VGG architecture, which is a composition of 5 blocks consisting of convolution and pooling layers, followed by a block of fully connected layers. And so so this is one of these VGG blocks that you stack 5 times, and the result is then a network of 19 layers, and comprising, of course, the final layers, the dense layers, to make the output. Notice that here the dense layer, the final output layer, has a size of 1000. This is because these networks have been trained on the ImageNet data, which is a classification, which is a benchmark data set where the inputs are images and the outputs are a category among 1000 different possible categories. So you would find animals, objects, and other things. So what is interesting to notice from this architecture with respect to the previous one, so when you compare VGG to AlexNet, is that in VGG they were using a first convolutional layer in which the kernels had a size of 11 by 11. But actually this was not needed provided that you can make the network deeper. And this is precisely what they did in VDG. So they went from 8 to 19 layers. And by doing that, they didn't need to have kernel size that were very large. And so they just were using, in this case, 3x3 kernels, because they knew they could, because of the increase of depth, that would compensate for the size of the kernel, right? And this is exactly what happened. I think I've already mentioned that already, but this slide is describing this again. If you consider the effective receptive field as the part of the visual input that affects a given unit somewhere in one of these layers, right? Then the size of this receptive field will increase linearly with the depth, right? So if you, for example, look at this third layer and this particular unit in yellow in this third layer, right? Its receptive field, right? It corresponds to the size of the kernel associated to this layer. So for example, it would be a 3x3, right? But it would be 3x3 only with respect to the previous layer. But then if you go back, if you go backward up to the input, the original input, right? Since these previous units would themselves have been computed by, for example, 3x3 from 3x3 kernels, that means now the effective receptive field of this unit at layer 3 is much larger than 3x3, right? And in this case, it corresponds to, if I'm not mistaken, to the entire image, or this 5x5 receptive field, right? And this is quite nice because not only you can compensate by stacking several convolutions like this, you would increase the effective receptive field of the kernels, but you would do so using fewer parameters, right? So you could have directly said, I'm using 5x5 kernels, but to represent them, you would need 25 numerical values, right? On the other hand, if you just stack two 3x3 kernels, they would have the same 5x5 effective receptive field, but you would only require 18 parameters to do that. So there is a question by Louis, where are the ReLU activations? They are not shown, in this figure, but this is a good question. Of course, at every convolution is followed by a ReLU activation, and the same for the dense layers, which are shown here. Right, if you compare the net, it's not shown either. But of course, there are ReLU activations almost everywhere, after every convolution or after every dense layer. Right. So this VGG was the winning solution of the same challenge, but 2 years later, another very good solution was the Google Net by researchers at Google. And it's also defined as a composition of this convolution and pooling layers, except that now it's getting more and more complicated. What they did is they had a first input part made of 7x7 convolutions, then pooling, convolution, pooling, and then they define what they call inception blocks, which are basically defined along 4 different paths. First, you take the input, then you compute a 1x1 convolution on this input, or you do this 1x1 and you follow it by a 3x3 convolution with padding of 1, or you do 1x1 and then 5x5 with padding of 2, or you do pooling and then 1x1 convolution, and then you would obtain 4 different output tensors, which you can, and then you concatenate them together into a larger tensor, and you repeat this whole inception block a few times. In this case, it would first repeat would first be repeated twice. Then you would do pooling. You would repeat this whole thing 5 times. You would do pooling. You would repeat that thing twice again, and then a pooling, and then a dense layer. Then 1 year later came ResNet, which is still one of the most popular neural networks when it comes to images. And the reason is that this network, the winning solution was made of more than 150 layers, so a very, very deep neural network. And it was defined as a composition, as a stack of what they call residual blocks, followed by some pooling layer. And so these residual blocks are quite interesting, actually, because they are defined with 2 paths for the data. You have a first pass, which is a regular small convnet, so you do convolution, ReLU, convolution. It's mixed with this normalization layer that I've mentioned last time, but this is not too important here. And then finally a ReLU. But what also happens is that the data could pass, of course, through this small convnet, but it could just shortcut completely this computation and go through this path, which we call skip connections on the right. And at the end, what you would do is that you would compute as output the sum of the output of the convnet with the original data. And in a sense, the effect of that is that in terms of the gradient, it will, because you have these skip connections, the gradient will be allowed to go through them without vanishing. So if you, even if you were using ReLUs, as we've seen, as a solution to the vanishing gradient problem, if you try to stack as many as 150 layers, you would still have problems with the vanishing gradient problem. By introducing these skip connections, you allow basically when you compute the backward path, you allow the gradient to follow, to use the skip connection in this way, right? There is no activations which are involved here. And because of that, the gradient would not vanish. Okay, so that's what I just said. What is interesting also is what happens in terms of the geometry of the loss landscape. So what you see here is a representation of the loss surface for ResNet with 56 layers. First, without this additional shortcuts, these skip connections. And second, when you add them at a few places in the architecture. And you see that a nice effect, of course, for the gradient to not vanish anymore, but also to smooth the surface of the loss. That means basically it will be much easier to optimize this than to optimize that on the left. All right. And so from this competition, one of the main outcomes is that depth really has a benefit in neural networks. This is also why we're actually talking about deep learning, because the depth, the number of layers that you put in this network happens to be quite important. And so in the last 2 columns correspond to the last 2 winning solutions that were not using deep neural networks. And you see that the accuracy that was achieved, no, not the accuracy, the error in this case that was achieved was in 2010 about 20%, then 25%, and they were basically all built on domain motivated features that would be encrafted, and then that would compute and then feed as input to a traditional machine learning model, could be an MLP or something else like a random forest or a boosting algorithm. But then the next year, in 2012, came AlexNet, whose architecture I've introduced a few slides before. which you see in just 1 year, the improvement was significant from 25 to 16, although the previous improvement was only about 3%. And then from this, the winning solution were basically just about making it possible to add more and more layers. And you see that by 2015, the number of layers had increased to 150, reaching a performance which was the lowest. Now this competition is over, and the result has been over since a few years now. And of course, it was still based on deep neural networks with a few more tricks. And what is also interesting there is that the performance of this network achieved superhuman performance. So the predictions were better than predictions computed by a panel of humans on this image. And I think the performance of humans was about between 2 and 3%, if I remember correctly. A question from the chat: is it possible to add these skip connections in a fully connected neural network? Does it make sense too? Yes, that's something you can do, of course. And that may help if you want to have a very deep MLP. That's a good idea, actually, to add the skip connection. All right. So finally, now that we know how to architecture ConvNet and how to train them, and that I've told you that, and that I've shown you that indeed this seems to work quite well on images, it might be interesting to try to understand exactly what's happening in this network and what kind of patterns, what kind of motifs do they learn from the data that we feed them. However, and unfortunately, even though they work quite well, when it comes to understanding what they learn, that's quite complicated. And the tools that we have to do that are actually quite limited. But I will show you a few of them, and already from those we can get some insight about what this network actually do. So a first way to do that is to look simply as the kernels, the convolutional kernels that are learned, and to look them simply as images. And from this, we can already learn a lot. Another thing that we can do is to look at internal activations on a single sample as image. Yes. So by that, I mean you would look at simply the feature map that are computed inside the network, and you would look at them really as images. And from this also you can gain insight. Like if you remember, I've shown you this, right? It's as if you were looking. So these two images are just the result of some convolution applied to the previous layer. But by just looking at that, we can get insight about what these convolutions are actually doing. In this case, detecting edges of some orientation. Right? You could also look at the distribution of activations on a population of samples, or look at the derivative of the response with respect to the input. And finally, and this is something we'll do, to try to synthesize artificial samples that would induce a maximum response on some particular or specific or selected kernel in the architecture. For ResNet, there was two types of skip connections, one with one-by-one convolution and one without. Can you comment, explain why? Yeah, so this one-by-one, yeah, so the question, yeah, I will just say the question again for the video. So the question is, in ResNet, you see that there are two types of skip connections that have been introduced by the authors. Either this one, where there is just a direct shortcut without passing through the ConvNet, in which you just it's as if there was an identity operation for X, and you add X to the output of the convnet. Or what you do is that you pass X through a 1-by-1 convolution. So the purpose of this 1-by-1 convolution is to basically, which you could do a few times, by the way, which be basically a way to compute some linear combinations across the channels. It's as if you were remixing the channels, but by, of course, preserving the spatial content. And this, in this case, would not involve any activation function, so the gradient would pass also quite well through this function. But in practice, I cannot say if really one is really better than the other. I suppose it depends on the architecture. In this case, in the case of ResNet, it was even more complicated because they were mixing these two schemes, and why, for example, they had these two blocks, these two ResNet blocks without the 1-1 convolution for this part, but then they repeated skip with 1-by-1 convolutions, and then without for 3 times. That I don't know. I suppose they discovered that this was working well, but the reason why I couldn't tell. So also you see that from this architecture there is a lot of engineering which is going on, really explaining why something would be better than something else is something which is an open question in the field, and this requires a lot of know-how and a lot of experimentations if really your goal is to obtain the very best neural network on some specific data. All right, so let's look at these convnets once they are trained. So the first thing you could do is to simply look at the filters as if they were images. And so what you see here is the filters, the kernels that are learned in the first convolutional layer of this low-net neural network. And what you can maybe see, even though it's not very clear, is that some of them seems to be specialized in the detection of, for example, edges along this diagonal, others along this diagonal or this one, maybe also horizontal, or is there any vertical pattern somewhere? Difficult to say something. I don't see any. Nope. Or maybe this one. Yeah. So of course, the interpretation of these filters is very limited and subjective, but it seems as if these filters were some kind of maybe a bit more advanced edge detectors in the image. If you look at the second convolutional layers, and you would show the 32 first filters, this is what you would see. And there, in my opinion, it's very difficult to at least on these ones, to say something very conclusive. There are combinations of the previous inputs of the which are already these convolved images, and there it's quite difficult to make sense of what is actually going on. So let's pick another network. This is AlexNet. This first winning neural network on ImageNet. And if you remember, it was using 11 by 11 filters, if I'm mistaken. Yes. And you would have 96 of them. So what is shown here are the 21st of these 96 filters. Yeah, and they are kernels that would apply on the 3 channels of the RGB input image. So first kernel would be this first column, the second kernel would be this second column, and so on and so forth. Right? And there, because the filters are larger, they're also easier to interpret. you really see that you have clearly edge detectors like this, of various orientations. Maybe here, for example, this one is interesting. You would have a filter that would respond differently depending on the channel, like the color. So for the green, it would respond differently than for the red and the blue. Exactly what does that mean, I'm not sure, but that's kind of interesting. Right, so this is the first thing you could do, in order to get inside, but as I said, I think it's quite limited. Another thing that you can do is to compute maximum response samples. There, I think it's quite interesting. So the idea is to look for synthetic input images, X, that would maximize the activation of some specific kernel U at some layer L in the filter bank in the output feature map of some layer. And so if this is the activation for the image, right, what you would want is to maximize it. And for example, to find an image X, which would produce an output at this particular layer L for this output channel D, which would be the highest, for example. The highest would be defined, for example, by the norm of this vector. Right. And so the idea then is to do gradient descent. Now, not in parameter space, but directly in the space of the pixels of the image, so on X, in order to maximize this activation. And so, for example, you could start with some random noise image drawn from a uniform, and then you would do gradient descent by maximizing this loss, by maximizing the norm of the activation for that selected kernel. Right? If you do that and try to synthesize image, for example, that would maximize the activation of a few of the first filters in the VGG network in the very first convolutional layer. These are the kind of images that will be produced. And what you see there is that it seems that some of the kernels, some of the filters are specialized to some colors, like orange, pink, green. Some others also are also trying to detect maybe edges, like horizontal edges or vertical edges or diagonal in one or the other direction. You also observe this kind of small dots, like small things, and this filter would be specialized into the detection of these things. If you go deeper and pick the second set of layers and do the same exercise, again, what we see is that some of the filters would respond maximally for edges into some or the other orientation. We would start seeing some textures which are a bit more complicated, like these dots, or this kind of dots, but a bit squarish in a sense. And also these bigger blobs now that have appeared in this synthetic image. Third layer, again, same story, except that now it seems that the images have patterns, have texture, which are in a sense larger than for the two previous ones. Right? The width of these lines is already a bit slightly larger than before. What you also see from this is that now it seems that we are starting to see compositions of patterns that you had detected before. And for example, these lines, so this filter would be maximally active if for images that have both that have diagonal lines across both directions, right? So you see this kind of mesh that is induced, that is looked for by this filter or these other ones. Again, some other kind of textures like these small dots and so on. Fourth set of layer, this one is really interesting. There you really see that the network has learned to detect patterns that are way more complicated than before. It really corresponds to textures made of simpler patterns in a sense. So you kind of see this kind of curves, this kind of mesh again, this kind of blobs, I don't know, and this as well. Fifth set of layer. So we are going deeper and deeper now into the network. And this is the kind of images that would lead to the maximum activations of these filters. And there you see that now it's getting more and more abstract, but in a sense, it seems as if we could start recognize objects in these images. Okay? So I don't know if you, I mean, maybe it's very subjective, but I don't know, this make me think from very, very far, like as if they were buildings. These ones, I don't know, parts of these small things there, parts of some animal, I don't know. Well, so again, this is quite subjective, but what is, I think, quite interesting to notice and to remember is that so our observations could be summarized as follows. So the first layers, they appear, at least from just empirical observations, they appear to encode for example, things like direction and color. And then as you get deeper and deeper, the direction and color gets combined into grid and maybe spot textures. So textures that are still simple, but that gets more and more complicated as you go higher and higher or deeper and deeper into the network, in order then to form more and more complex patterns. And so what happens is that the network, even though it was not told to look for things specifically, because of the inductive bias that we put, because of these hierarchical compositions that we have set in the network, it seems that it appears to learn a hierarchical composition of patterns, right? And to do so directly from the data that we feed to the network. And so this is another representation of the same kind of things, where the network is taking as input an image, and then depending on the activation or the feature realization that you consider, the one that are very close to the input would correspond to edges, but as you go deeper and deeper, they would correspond to higher and higher level features, like in this case, I don't know, a wheel, or some part of a bird, and other things like this. And then, of course, if now you have a feature representation in which the feature's value directly determine, for example, the presence of a wheel, of a door, and these kind of things, then you understand also quite well it will be much easier than for the MLP taking as input this higher level representation to classify correctly the images, instead of directly dealing with the pixels as raw values. Right. So now I just want to make to ask you a question. Let's say I do the same exercise. I want to compute a maximum response image that would maximize not one specific the activation of one specific kernel, but would maximize the activation of one specific output of my vector of probability estimates. For example, I could pick the output that corresponds to the class of a bird, and then I would just do the same trick. I would do gradient percent in pixel space in order to maximize this output. What do you think? Can you tell me what do you think that would be the result that I would obtain? Do you think I would obtain the image of a bird, a nice looking bird, or would I obtain something else? No one? that will generate images that look like what the neural network has been trained to recognize. Yeah, that's what we would expect. But if you do that, well, if, for example, I'm taking as output the one that corresponds to the category of a magpie, and then I synthesize an image which would maximally activate this output, then this is the kind of things the network would classify with 99% confidence as being a bird and a magpie. Even though I cannot see any bird in this image, the neural network can. So this is just to warn you about also the subjectiveness of this interpretation of what's going on in the neural network. Even though I can tell you this nice story, right, that it seems that it's learning patterns and composing them in some hierarchical fashion, and it seems that we can recognize stuff in this. There are still a lot going on which we don't understand. In particular, why this image would be classified as a bird, even though for us as humans there is no bird, but for the neural network there is one, and it's very confident about that. And just to tell you, to show you more about this, so what you will see there are some kind of hallucinations that we call deep dream that you can extract from a convnet. And it's basically applying this ID, but in a loop. So you would start from some image xt, right? And then at every step, at every frame, so the goal would be to make a video. So at every frame, you will just shift at random this image, maybe enhance or rescale some part. And then you will enhance, you will modify the pixels in order to maximally activate some also random kernel in the network. And then you will zoom in and repeat over and over to then produce a sequence of images xt from 0 to number of frames that you want in the video. So in the video they are doing that, and they would start by trying to maximize the activation of the very first of kernels in the very first layers. And what you see is the kind of things we have seen before for VGG. The image that are produced seems to be about colors, edges of like vertical lines, or horizontal or diagonal. And then what will happen is that during the generation of this video, they will switch to kernels that are deeper and deeper, located deeper and deeper into the network. So this is what already we see. Now we see that we are seeing compositions of lines. So there is a techno music, this thing. The mindset is that this neural network is basically making hallucinations. Then at some point what you will see, or I don't know, subjective, and you will tell me, but you should start seeing animals, or things that looks like animals. I'm not sure if you see the dogs. I can see them. So as I said, you should see dogs. All right, so I will just stop here. You get the idea. This is going on for a few more minutes. But again, this is just another way, in a sense, to try to see what the network has learned and the kind of patterns he expects to see and to respond to in natural images. And you see that indeed it seems to have captures concepts like parts of animals, like in this case the eyes or some kind of fur, and how it should combine these things, even though they don't look, I mean, this is a bit further into the video. Wait, right? They don't look very real either. Right, so I just let you think and make your own opinion about this. But yeah, I think it motivates. It's still nice because it seems that it's using things that we expect it to use, but maybe not exactly as we would want it to expect. All right, and then finally, yeah, Louis says that he prefers his own dog. I share the opinion. All right, and then finally, I want to conclude this lecture today. So we started by this discovery from Hubel and Wiesel, who studied the neural basis of the visual system, and then that motivated architectures for neural networks, right? But what is now also interesting is that because these neural network architectures are working so well, and because there are also parts of the biological visual system that we still do not understand, it's actually now giving inspiration in the other direction. So advances in deep learning in computer science are also now giving inspiration to neuroscientists. So this is a picture from a paper that appeared, I think, in Nature a few years ago. But I think this quote is quite interesting. So deep hierarchical neural networks are beginning to transform neuroscientists' ability to produce quantitatively accurate computational models of the sensory systems, especially in higher cortical areas where neural response properties had previously been enigmatic. And so I think this is quite interesting to see and to note that there is this inverse now, inverted, what do you want? That it's giving insight and ideas in the opposite direction. So not only as engineers and computer scientists, we can get inspiration from nature or from other sciences, but ourselves, we can also give inspiration to these other sciences. And I think this is quite nice to underline here. And this is what I wanted to conclude with for this lecture. Do you have questions?